My next guest is Martin Devon. He's an entrepreneur working on improving the health outcomes of using better data. However, he's also an elder in our men's group, and he's a dear friend for almost 20 years. Thanks for being here, Martin.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, before we start, I just wanted to say your superpower to me is your ability to be ninja about moving people through spaces. And what I mean by that is when people come to you with a question, you have a particular skill set to bring clarity to them. Can you say a little bit more about what your superpower is?
All right. Well, I appreciate you calling it a superpower. Really, what it is I listen to people and I'm present. And so I first of all help them clear what's in the way of them thinking clearly just by listening. A lot of the problems that we have when we're struggling with a question or struggling with an issue is that we're all in our heads. And so, I mean, there's technical terms for this. I don't know that's that important, but one of them is, for example, ruminating.
Hmm.
So I don't know when you think of young CK or young, I'll use young Martin as an example. I could think about, when I was in high school and I had a crush on a girl. And I'm thinking, does she like me? Does she not like me? I don't know how many times that thought could go through my head, right?
Hmm.
But hearing it once is probably enough. I'm not sure if this girl likes me. Well, what can I do about that? Before you can get to what can I do about that, I need to like let go of that thought and go on to the next one. And so a lot of what's going on is people are holding on to those thoughts instead of getting on with it. So that's a big part of my superpower.
Yeah, I mean, um, but how do you do that though? Right? How do you listen with pristineness without rumination? Because that's really easy to say, just don't think. But the moment you say don't think, it's paradoxical. You start thinking more. Actually, the
Right.
mind start to grasp at that idea of thinking.
Sure. I mean, you and I have done lots of courses around listening. So,
Hmm.
there are good courses out there that will help you do that. I don't know if you want to plug them.
Sure,
Um,
why not? I
yeah.
mean, if they work for you, by all
Yeah.
means.
So the landmark communication curriculum is really amazing when it comes to that. So there's two courses that just get you started at being a good listener, and then if you're like CK or me, you spend 2 years perfecting those skills. So those are really good ones to get you started. But I have, you and I both have some close friends who never did those courses and are excellent listeners. So more than anything else, it's a commitment to listening. And I know this sounds a lot easier than it is, but the key to listening is when you notice you're not listening, stop whatever you're thinking about and go back to listening. And so if you decide that you're going to practice it, and if you've got uh, really, if you've got friends, you've got people in your life, one thing I recommend highly if you want to become a good listener is have teenagers. That really helped my process. So,
Okay.
you have the occasion to practice and then you just listen.
Mm.
I know it sounds easier when you just say, oh, just listen, but you do it year after year. For those of you with kids, that's just an excellent way because you'll find that you become a better father or mother by listening to your kids and you have a better, like you enjoy your relationship with them better,
Mm.
even if you go through tough times.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
it, when people say, okay, so I'll use younger CK as an example. What you just said to younger CK would be, you can't be because it's so passive. But the older CK would say, well, if you actually listen well, it's active and is passive. The effort part is noticing whenever the mind goes away and then bring it back. That's the effort. But the passive part is just, no effort, just listen and receive whatever person has to say.
Well, if I was talking to young CK, how old were you when you were doing martial arts?
And when I started, 16.
Okay. And when you got your black belt?
I didn't never got my black belt. I was
Okay, how
close.
far did you get?
I got to brown.
That's just so non-CK, not completing something once you
Well,
started it.
I had to go away for college. That's my excuse. Yeah.
All right, no judgment. I'm just surprised. I mean, this would be the first time I know anything you started that you didn't
Yeah.
complete just because of your doggedness. Am I wrong?
Hmm. Yep, you know me well.
Okay, so I'm talking to young CK and let's say 16-year-old CK. So how's it going with your martial arts?
You're talking to younger CK?
Yeah, you remember what he was like?
Yeah, I do
Yeah.
remember. Yeah, I would
So so you're
pause.
doing your first kata or whatever.
Hmm.
How'd you get good at it?
Dogged determination, as you say.
Right? But if
Hmm.
you're doing like if you're doing if you're doing a strike or you're doing a block,
Hmm.
it's the mindset you've got to get to do that is the same as listening,
Mm.
right? Imagine you're sparring with an opponent and you're just if you're listening, you do better. If
Hmm.
you're not listening, you just well, you're going to do your punch. Oh,
Hmm.
my opponent isn't there for me to punch them.
Yep.
The same. It's the same. It's the same type of concentration,
Mm.
right?
Yeah. It requires full presence. The effort it requires to have full presence. Otherwise, punch is gonna come or kick is gonna come your way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, if you're talking to a young person, there be, if you do the whole flowery description, it's going to bore them, and it's not going to get, it's not going to get into the space where they're at. Like,
Yeah.
if you look at young people, I think about both my children when they were 5. You know, um, I I was doing a lot of Tai Chi. I remember my young one, she was 5 years old. She would play little energy tricks with me. She'd be holding my hand, and I'd look at her. I'm like, "Are you sending me energy?" And she just started laughing. Right? It's because for her it was play. I didn't say, "Okay, now meditate. Now
Mm.
do this breathing. Now clear." It's just like she's just playing with who she is. And
Mm.
I remember my older one. Uh, she just loved certain books. We go to the bookstore, and any book I bought, if she really wanted a book, she'd have the patience to sit there and read. It was not a
Mm.
problem. It's only when you tell them you got to sit still that it's the problem. But that's my
Mhm.
experience anyway.
Mm. Yeah, I appreciate this. Thank you. So maybe we could talk about something that we're really passionate about, men's work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, what's men's work for you?
Um, well, I don't look at it so much as men's work. I look at it as um, getting really clear about the source of my power. And
Hmm.
um, I think, like if I was a woman, I'd be passionate about what you'd call a women's work. But I'm a man, so, this is what works for me. But when um, I have so many women I have, in my life that I love that are close to me. And what's interesting is that when I'm being the man that I really want to be, they really like being around me. They like that guy.
Mm.
And when I was younger, one of my biggest frustrations and one of the big problems I had in relationships was that I I try and give people what they were asking for instead of what they needed, and I wasn't so much worried about who I am and what works for me.
Mm.
And um, so yeah, I don't know if that's giving you your answer. Maybe I just see it differently than you do.
No,
Um,
I mean it is. It's one answer, right? I'm not looking for a particular answer, you know. But some people may say, "Hey, the source of my power comes from my faith." I know you're also very you were raised Orthodox. Is that correct?
yeah, if you
Yeah.
look behind me, you can see many of my father's books.
Mhm.
If you're Orthodox, you know what a shas is, what a set of Talmud. So right by my ear over this one, behind that, you can see my dad's set of Talmud, my dad's shas.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't say I'm Orthodox anymore, far from it, but I very much, I'm very tied to my Jewish tradition, and
Mhm.
um, I mean, what's so interesting is if you look at the energetic, mystical side of different traditions, be they religious, be they, um, I mean, I don't know, what would you call the Chinese um, martial arts tradition? It's not really religious, but it's definitely a strong Chinese tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, what's interesting is because we're all human beings, the paths are the same. So you'll have um, I actually had this conversation with my rabbi a week ago in synagogue. If you look at the key Jewish meditations, they're the same as the ones you might find in the Indian, yoga culture, or the yoga way of looking at things, or the same you'd find in qigong or tai chi, or you know, there's a I've done the same meditation in a yoga class where the source material was in Sanskrit versus a Hebrew meditation where the sources were in Hebrew. And
Mm-hmm.
they're the same sounds, they're just spelled differently. It's like almost the exact same meditation. Um, and so it's, I don't know whether it was you that I was talking to. There was someone I was talking to um, who was trying to access, like there's a conversation within, let's say, Orthodox Judaism, and there's a similar conversation within fundamental Christianity where there are some strains of thought that are against meditation. And what's so interesting, well, I don't think it was with you. Was it? Does it sound familiar? This talk,
Mm-hmm.
CK?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. Where if for those of you that like practice a lot of yoga, you know about mudras, and those are basically hand positions that give you different energies. So if you are very aggravated, you have a particular mudra that you would do, putting your fingers together in a certain way that will give you calm. And so one of my favorite museums in LA is the Norton Simon Museum. And one of the things you can do is see some of the Renaissance art on the top floor. And you go look around and you see paintings of Jesus, or you see paintings of popes. And they're doing different things with their, where is this, different motions with their hands, right? And those of you that have done some of the yoga meditations, you know that what you do with your palms and how you sit cross-legged, you kind of can imagine what your finger positions are. And you go and you pay attention to the different paintings, you will see that Jesus is doing a mudra. And then you can go in that same Norton Simon and go in the basement, and they've got statues from all sorts of different countries. And you'll see that, you've got an elephant statue from Indian culture, and they're making the same hand positions as Jesus was. And this is back long before jets and travel. They weren't looking at the same. They didn't take it from each other. They both independently discovered, or their traditions discovered, what was effective, and they did them. So there's a strong meditation strain within Judaism that many rabbis aren't aware of. There's a strong meditation strain within Christianity that many denominations don't want to hear about it. And you could go on and on. So um, it's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question about why I find it so interesting to do, to study masculinity and femininity,
Yeah.
is because I'm kind of going back to what is it that I naturally do when I'm good at something. And I've done a lot of different courses where what they're trying to get me to do is something that goes against my grain.
Mm-hmm.
And I can do it, but I can't do it forever, or I can't
Mm-hmm.
always do it. Whereas if I'm doing something that is kind of congruent with me and what it is I want to accomplish, it's just very easy.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the core of this question, the why I mentioned, your religious background is how some people go to their head because they're strongly educated, a la me, right? Or some people go back to their cultural roots. I'm Latino or Chinese or Jewish or whatever as a way to locating the source of the power. So the core of this question is, how does one locate the source of the power? Because it's not just about the tools or the path. Rather, you mentioned a beautiful word, congruency. So how does one go about finding what's congruent internally to themselves, the truest self?
Again, it's going to sound deceptively simple. Look, start searching.
Hmm.
So, um, I find that this is kind of a full circle, right? So I did a lot of study. I went to yeshiva. I studied a lot of Jewish source material, and I got a certain level of understanding of it. But then I went and, like I studied Tai Chi and meditation and karate and Reiki and, a variety of other things. And then now I find myself looking back at the source material I studied when I was 16, 17, 18, and having seen a different context for it, I understand it differently than I did at a younger age. So I wouldn't say there's a formula, but one of the things you can do is really get to know your culture and the sources of power within your background, and then go
Mm.
study some other ones, and then come back to it.
Mm. It's interesting that you say that because that's kind of where I'm at right now. I appreciate the Chinese culture. Actually, no, let me correct myself. I didn't appreciate it so much when I was being imposed on. You got to learn all these poems, you got to learn all these calligraphy. And to me, it was just old knowledge, archaic. I don't need it. Why do I have to learn it? But now, as I went out to learn martial arts, come to America, learn the Western way of thinking, philosophize different tool sets, and finding myself more drawn to the Chinese culture of like Taoism, as an example, and the richness behind some of just the simple words and phrases that in Tao Te Ching, as an example.
Yeah, poor CK forced to learn Lao Tzu, right?
I didn't understand it. I didn't, or
Well,
Confucius, yeah. Mhm.
yeah, but I mean, like, how much would I love to be able to read a Lao Tzu poem in the original? I mean, obviously not enough to learn Chinese to be able to do it properly so far yet, but there's a certain beauty in it that you can appreciate that I'll never appreciate. But if you're
Mhm.
forced to do it, you're not going to do it.
Yeah, yeah. So pay attention, try out going back to the cultural roots, and now with a new lens, being older, looking
Yeah.
back, what the new appreciation that you may have, or to understand the nuance of what they were teaching earlier. Anything else?
I mean, it really depends on your audience, right? Like, there was a tool set I wanted to give my kids. And one of the great things about having teenagers is that they teach you that they're their own people and
Hmm.
they're not going to do whatever it is you tell them.
Hmm.
Um, so, I mean, I'd have a different answer for someone who's 16, someone who's 21, someone who's 31, someone who's 45. It
Hmm.
really depends on where you're at and what your next set of problems is.
Mm.
The universal tool set is don't worry, don't look behind you. Uh, the past is the past, and just enjoy every moment, be present. I sound like a Hallmark ad, and very, very trite, but that's, don't sweat. What was that expression?
Don't sweat the small
The
stuff
small stuff, and it's all
because
small stuff.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so let's double click on that just for a moment because, one may say, hey, there's value in looking at the past because the past gives us clues, but you don't want to dwell on the past. And there's value in staying present, and because the past or the future don't really matter anyway, because all we have is the present. What would you say for someone who is still grappling with that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if my earlier answer, so, I'm dwelling in the past. If my earlier answer about like ignore the past is, it's not exactly what I mean. There's lessons that you can learn about your mistakes. So, Sahil Bloom has this really interesting Substack, and one that I was looking at the other day was the harsh truths. And so, if you want to look at your past, that's a good way to look at it. Like, what are the harsh truths you can learn about your past? The problem with looking at your past is you get all emotional. I don't,
Mm-hmm.
not that emotions are bad, but you get you get stuck or caught in your past, and you wind up in rumination, or you wind up in
Mm-hmm.
regret.
Mm-hmm.
The good thing about looking at the past is really just for learning lessons,
Mm-hmm.
not for regret, not for dwelling.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
if you could learn to look at your past, and I don't know, so let's say you did an exercise and you, um, like CK, you're doing. I joke with you about this, right? But you have a PhD in,
Biomedical engineering.
and you've used the how?
Just the meta framework, how to learn, but the actual content, not at all.
Okay, so if I was asking you, would you to do it all over again, would you get a PhD?
So it's a two-part answer. One, I wouldn't, however, but I also want to say I wouldn't be the person I am today without having gone through that experience.
Okay,
So no
but
regrets there.
bottom line, you have to learn the lesson. What's the lesson?
The
Yeah,
lesson, the big lesson there is not to grasp on this fantasy of when I have X, then my life would turn out, because it's a lesson that I have to keep learning over and over again. Hence why this whole focus around deep joy and purpose with this podcast.
right.
Hmm.
So, you know, um, you could be in a place where like, oh my God, I spent so much time and energy getting
Hmm.
PhD, and I really suffered. Did you suffer a little bit when you're doing PhD?
Yes.
Was it was it as much fun as it sounds like?
You mean the suffering, or?
No, like getting a PhD in your
Oh yeah,
topic
yeah.
sounds like
No,
a
I
lot of
mean
fun,
actually doing it is it's not a fun experience at all.
right?
Yeah.
But if you look at it and you just abstract, okay, what did you learn? I mean, knowing you, I'd say one of the things you learned for yourself is that you could actually do that. It's a very
Hmm.
difficult thing. It's a very big accomplishment. Now, it's a lot of time and money to spend where you could say, well, I could have just done a marathon, right? But
Yes.
it's an intellectual marathon, right?
Yep.
And and you have the credential, which is good.
Hmm.
Um, but what lessons do you learn from it? Like the most valuable thing is what lessons did you learn?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah,
I would say to anyone who's listening, that is the thing, because there's the event that happened, and there's the subjective experience, and there are the lessons. And I would say for myself, I would, in the past, I would have just done it and then moving on to the next thing, like as quickly as possible. Because in my mind, the biohacker, the life hacker in me just wanted to keep going forth. But in reality, is the having the experience, having the event that happened, having the experience, really immerse myself in it, and then extract as much life lesson out of it as possible.
yeah. The other place to look for me, I think part of the reason I find that I have a lot of Chinese and Taiwanese friends, and I think growing up with a Jewish mother or an Asian mother, there's a lot of, or father, there's a lot of similarities. Like there's a lot of pressure to do well academically, and especially when it comes to, like I almost did an MBA and a law degree to make my parents happy. I went as far as doing the LSAT and the GMAT, and then I
Hmm.
just said, like, no, I'm done.
Hmm.
Like I know I could have done those graduate schools, but it's like, why am I doing them? And that's some of it. It's funny. I hated that as a kid, but I realized how much I was pushing my kids towards the same thing.
Mm.
And it's funny, like how much of what you're doing, like you may blame your parents for things, but those are things that were imprinted generations and generations ago.
Hmm. So
Uh,
you did it anyway, or you had the insight to stop yourself from continuing the generational pattern?
I mean, to a certain extent, I stopped myself, but um, one of the things that I was amazed to learn about myself is how much of what I do is just programming. Um, you want to hear my funny example of that?
Yeah, go for it.
When I was younger, one of the things that annoyed the living crap out of me was how my mom, when she was frustrated and she didn't like the way my brother and I were carrying on or fighting or whatever we're doing, she's like, I'm going to count to three. One, two, three. And I'm like, Mom, like what there was, oh my God, my mom is counting. What's going to happen? What, you know, and then my kids, I don't know how they were old, 6, 7 years old. And I was exasperated with them. I was just so angry. I'm going to count to three. And I go one, two. And then I hear my mother and I just burst out into laughter. I'm like, oh my God, where did that come from? Like, why am I saying the things I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Mm.
we think that we have everything that comes out of our mouths is you know, on purpose. But the
Yeah.
reality is so much of it is programming.
Yeah. Okay, so let's double click on that. How do we discern, truth versus illusion? What we want versus programming? Because there's actually a lot of debate going on right now. One may say, yeah, it's all free will. That's one spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is there's no free will. It's all programming. How do you discern when is programming and when is actually your sole expression of what you truly desire?
So I could get really philosophical about it, but that's not going to really help anyone,
Hmm.
right? I could say no matter what I do, I never have free will,
Hmm.
right? Because you could ruminate endlessly about how deep
Yeah.
does the
Hmm.
rabbit hole go.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Um, once you get clear enough about what you're about and what's important to you, uh, you start to develop an ear to what you're saying, and you can really focus and realize this is what I'm saying, and I'm saying it on purpose. I mean to say this. And other times you're talking, but you're not really present.
Hmm.
So um, you see your mom and you say, Hi, Mom, how's it going? She said, I'm doing well. How are you doing? Well, I just finished this class and I had breakfast with this friend, did this other thing. And you realize you've been talking for 10 minutes and you haven't actually paid attention to what you're saying,
Hmm.
right? So that's programming.
Hmm.
But then you might like just stop, look your mom in the eye and ask her a question. Like, what are you look at your mom and you're like, what am I curious about my mom? I might say, Mom, what was it like when you were in the French countryside, you were picking fruit? How did you decide what fruit you were going to pick? And how did you know you had enough fruit?
Mm.
Right? It's like you actually think about what do you want to have on purpose discussion with your mom? Like since my mom died, there's sometimes I'm like, oh, yeah, there's questions I wanted to ask her, and I wish I could ask her. Same with my dad.
Mm.
So for those of you that have living parents, be curious. Ask the questions that you're not going to be able to ask one day.
Mm. That's a beautiful exercise. So, on the theme of learning and teaching, so one exercise that I've started taking on is asking those questions of my parents, thanks to our men's group, right? The question about legacy and curiosity about grandparents and so forth. And one thing I will do is to start recording those conversations, for the sake of continuation of the legacy, the memories or stories and so forth. And I know that other people have done it and they really appreciate the fruit of that. On the realm of teaching, have you thought about recording yourself so then that way your grandkids or your kids can one day, know about you at this age going forth? You think that will be a meaningful exercise?
Um, yeah, well, so I remember when the kids were really young, I would journal, and I would journal as I'm talking to them. But I never wound up giving them the journals.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I found is like I was just trying to work out things for myself more than I was winding up communicating with them.
Mm-hmm.
I do think about doing that. Um,
Communicating with them or
yeah,
journaling,
just recording.
public,
No,
publish your
recording.
thoughts.
I mean, this when my kids were young, that was pre-internet, pre you'd record stuff for yourself. It would be like more like you do a cassette tape, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so sometimes I think about like turning on the computer and sending letters to my kids. I don't. I feel so self-conscious. I think is the reason why I don't do that. But
Self-conscious, as in like
yeah, I
they
feel
may
like I'm
perceive it.
self-important.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
would perceive it as you being self-important,
I perceive it as self-important. I don't
or
know.
that you perceive it as self-important.
Yeah, maybe next time I talk to them, I'll ask them, is that something they would like?
Mm. So you want to do this in service of them rather than in service of yourself, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, even this podcast, right? Any kind of media that we make, video, recording, writing, letters, I think there's an element of self-importance because I am important enough to have a conversation with my friend in a public way, so to speak. But I think the exercise itself has its own merit and value. So,
yeah. Okay, so you're making me think about this some more. I think for me, there's a difference between a conversation and a soliloquy,
mhm,
and I get a lot more value out of conversations, and I think
right.
they provide more value. There's something magical about two or more people talking and interacting
Hmm.
than someone writing a monologue.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go down that rabbit hole a bit. Because you and I, we talked about how you were a blogger and you were quite a famous one back in the day. And then you
Internet famous.
internet famous, and then you realize that it was just lots of talk, mouthpieces talking about things, espousing things. And once you realize that, you stop because you didn't want to add to the milieu of, you know,
Yeah.
polarized
So
conversations and opinions and so forth.
yeah. So once you start doing transformation work, or at least in my case, um, what I realized is that there's a difference between just manufacturing opinion and having genuine conversations. Like I find the cancel culture today so interesting because you talk about and I get it. I have the same thing too. Sometimes I will say, this person is X.
Hmm.
But the truth is, like, do I even believe the stuff I think I believe? It's like thoughts are so ephemeral and positions you take are so ephemeral.
Yeah.
So, like, let me see if I can explain what I mean, because it's a little hard to pin down. So what I'm trying to say is when you're writing down and you're writing an opinion, right? So most people, um, like when I don't know, when you were married, CK, did you and your wife have a foreign policy position?
No, I mean, not
Right.
to the place of a position paper, if that's what you mean.
Right? Like your relationship didn't require that, right?
Correct.
You guys came up with like what was your Hong Kong policy?
There's
Oh,
a there's a foreign policy opinion, but not a position.
well, and so that's where I'm getting to. And what is even the opinion? So there's
Mhm.
an old joke my dad used to tell me, which is a lot funnier in Yiddish, but I'll tell you anyway. So he said, man was asked, um, so how do you and your wife get along, and what makes your relationship work so well? And it's a man that was relatively well to do, and they had eight kids back then, between them. My dad was saying, right? And he says, so they asked him, he says, well, how do you guys do it? Well, I take care of the important stuff. Like I figure out what our political opinions are, what we should do about the czar, what we should do about, these very important matters. And my wife decides where the kids go to school and where we live and what we eat and basically our social calendar. So, I handle the big stuff and she handles the small stuff, right?
Mm.
Um, so, you know, most people, like if you're running for Senate, you're running for Congress, you got to put out these position papers. And if you really talk to those people and you talked honestly, even the most ideological person, they probably only believe, there's maybe 3 or 4 things that are super important to them.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of it is the party they happen to be in.
Mm-hmm.
And more of it is, okay, so I need $1 million to win this seat or to have a hope of winning this seat.
Mm-hmm.
So, these people will give me money if I support this position. Well, I kind of do support that. And they pretend, either they know cynically or they pretend to themselves, well, yeah, I kind of agree with that. Yeah, they talk themselves into whatever their opinions are. But very few of our opinions are really strongly held. Most of them have to do with where we come in culturally, where we, like what we were grown up with, what our parents always did, and we don't think hard about, you know, a particular foreign policy issue, like the current thing between Putin and what he did. Like you may have opinions about Putin, you may have opinions about the whole thing, but you couldn't find most people couldn't find the area on the map. Most people, like my father's family came from that area. So I know quite a lot about all the different parties. And, I just happen to know a fair amount about that situation. But when I listen to people give their opinions, I can tell they're just waving a flag, which, I'm not even saying what your opinion should or shouldn't be. I'm just saying most people's opinions aren't very informed. They're just
Mm-hmm.
picking a team. And, I love to do that. I love hockey and I love the LA Kings. And irrationally, I tell you, the Kings can do no wrong. When they play, there's no Kings that do any dirty plays on the ice. It's always,
The
whoever
other
our
team.
enemy is, the
Mm-hmm.
Edmonton Oilers or the Anaheim Ducks. Oh my God, you have no idea how evil those people are,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the reality is, it's just laundry, as Seinfeld says. We're just choosing what side we're on, and we're making our opinions. There are a very few things that you feel very strongly about. So, if you have children and there's a particular issue that affects your children, or if you had a particular trauma as a young adult, and then a particular issue may make a big difference for you, so then you form an opinion and it makes a difference for you. So, boy, we're getting long-winded here, or I am anyway. um, Getting back to your point, most of what you're doing is manufacturing opinions. A good conversation is not about what opinion you hold. It's about an interchange of ideas that moves your understanding forward. And those are the conversations that I want to be having.
Great. Okay, so the reason why I even brought that up in the first place is this. Um, those could be a origin of an interesting conversation, either offline or the next quote unquote public conversation per se, right? So for me, I'm with you. I like conversations. I don't like writing as a medium personally because everything I say requires context, and if I'm just writing things, I need to arbitrarily set a context, but it takes a lot of work to set that stage. Then it makes it really challenging for me because I'm such a Taoist person. I don't have a black answer or a white answer. It's nuanced. So I needed to set the stage. Hence why I don't particularly enjoy the writing medium as an example.
Do you enjoy reading?
I enjoy conversations more. Reading from certain people because of the clarity of their thought, and they can say the economy of words is so precise. I enjoy reading those type of people, but otherwise, the signal to noise is way too low for me to read.
So you enjoy reading but not writing.
I enjoy reading, but but more importantly, I enjoy the conversation as a medium. And how do we create things, artifacts that allows for more conversation to happen. And all right, I remember why I asked that question in the first place, because when you share artifacts, it allows for having conversation at scale, and that to me ultimately is what culture, or what company, organizations are, community, culture, society, and humanity as a whole. It's just lots and lots of different conversations happening all at the same time. So since we love conversations, I was curious to know how we could facilitate more fruitful conversations versus just you know jabbing and moving our mouth and moving through life that way.
20 years ago, did you think podcasts would become a thing?
20 years ago, no, because I wasn't even aware of this such a thing.
Right? What
Yeah.
about 10 years ago?
10 years ago, I knew it was a thing. I knew that I was in podcast addict for many years.
Why do you think you're a podcast addict?
I was, because I was looking for information, and their information that was not shared in a book, because they can also provide that nuance, that context, as we were speaking about certain things.
Yeah. So I was shocked by how much I love podcasts when I started listening to them.
Hmm.
And um, what I discovered, I don't know if this is the truth, but this is kind of what I came to, is that evolutionarily, um, we have been telling stories
Hmm.
for thousands of generations, millennia, maybe a million years. I mean, nobody knows for sure because they couldn't record conversations back then, but we've been having conversations. If you look at, like, songs were originally conversations, right, around the campfire and what have you.
Hmm.
And we've been writing for a very short period of time, comparatively, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Not even a tenth of how long we've been having conversations. And who was writing? A very minuscule portion of the population. I remember when I was studying English literature, and who was it that we were talking? There was one author we were talking about. I can't remember who it is. Um, it'll come to me. Anyway, they said at that time, and this was in the early Renaissance, everyone who wrote, like, the author that wrote that book, and anyone, almost anyone that could have read it, in their library, they possessed every book that was available at that time. I mean, some of them were destroyed and in fire and what have you. But basically, just like I've got a library behind me, they had a library and it had every book and you could possibly read. And of course, you know, you couldn't read every book that was written in the U.S. this month. Would take you more than a lifetime, let alone all the books that have been written. And so our brains are not evolved to read and to take information that way. And reading is wonderful, but we don't get context from reading. We don't even necessarily understand the books that we're reading. That's one factor. The second factor is we most people have no idea how much language moves. Like, unless you study linguistics, you don't understand. If you've tried to read Chaucer, and then you try to read Shakespeare, and then you try to read Moby Dick, you know, um, Chaucer and Shakespeare are about as far away from each other as Moby Dick is from Shakespeare. You see just how much the language moves. So we think we're understanding certain books, but we're not. So I use Shakespeare as the example because a few years ago, the BBC rediscovered the meaning of certain words and the
Mm,
pronunciation of them, and realized that one of the most famous Shakespeare plays was some of the famous lines were actually rhyming, and we never saw them as rhyming. And
mm,
it's actually funny, and it makes a whole different. So you might study Shakespeare your whole life and not realize you don't actually get this play.
mm-hmm,
But when you hear a conversation, you get so much of the context. So when I hear Tim Ferriss talk to Jocko Willink, whether the conversation had happened 10 years ago or it happened 10 minutes ago, when I listen to it, I sort of get it. And I'm really clear about what I don't get. Because if there's a word that's being used differently, I can kind of hear it. Well, Jocko said the word blah, but he said it in a jocular way. And we think that word is an insult. So what is he saying? What's going on? So there's just that much more information that your brain processes. And it's a whole channel that like goes straight into our understanding. We get so much pleasure from podcasts. And even though we're trained that reading is the thing, it's actually listening is the thing.
right. So what do you see as an avid student of learning, as an avid teacher or a student of teaching? Yeah, you also love transformation as well. So to me, conversations are, great transformational medium, or at least that has the potential to transform someone, even if they're just watching two people having a conversation. And in terms of amplifying that, right, bringing more positivity or more awakenings of the world through conversations, do you see any areas for how conversations can play a role in that using modern technology?
Yeah, for sure. Um, I've been watching your Noble Warrior experiment with a lot of interest, and like for me, what I've done so far, like I'll dip in and out of it, and it's like there's certain conversations that are interesting to me. So I
Hmm.
did a series, as you know, you were part of it, around what we used to call Corona, like what is the COVID-19? What just trying to understand it. It was clear that something big was going on, and it there are a lot of changes to our world that came out of the pandemic. And so I did a series trying to understand it. And then it was done. Um, I don't, yeah. Like the thing that's so cool about conversation is I don't know where it's going to go. I don't think either of us had an idea where this was going to lead until we started talking. So doing an ongoing conversation series, I have a hard time conceiving about where it's going to go. But maybe the lesson for me is to let that go and just have conversations with people that I find interesting and people that I love, and just trust that it's going to go to an interesting place and that people are going to enjoy watching it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
No, you're welcome. Thank you for being here. I mean, I'm asking that question, also sorting this out for myself, right? I mean, because we had talked about how at the surface level, this it requires a certain level of self-importance, right? Two people talking, make it public, like, hey, someone's gonna watch this and find value out of that. So there's a certain level of self-importance. But I am a believer that there's also certain levels of we just don't know where the ripple effect would take. And we also talked about private the structural aspect of this because um doing it live is one structure, doing it in Discord is another structure, doing it on a video form on TikTok or a short form is another structure, or a long form on YouTube is another structure. So what are some of the structures to help hone, because this is all energy, this is all conversations happening, and how do we create the structure such that it channels um where and guides where this energy is going to go. I think it's a useful skill. It's an important skill to curate how this conversation goes or where this conversation goes.
Well, I think the true conversation is the long form conversation, right? Um, but I find like even my favorite podcasts, the ones that are long, I just can't possibly hear them all. I just don't have enough hours. So there have been times where I listen to a Jocko podcast for 4 hours, and I'd be like, I wish they could keep going. This is so interesting. Um, but if you told me, okay, go listen to this podcast, it's only 4 hours, right? How many 4 hour podcasts, if I send you, this is awesome, are you going to listen to? Maybe you'll listen to the first 10 minutes, and if you get enthralled, great. But that's kind of the problem with them. But those are the great conversations. So the short form, using Jocko as an example, um, have you ever heard his little excerpt where he talks about good? You know, when you're up for a job and you lose the job, and he would also say, good. You know,
Mm-hmm.
again, I have more time to hone my craft before I take that level position. Or
Mm.
we're waiting for some certain equipment, some new advanced equipment, and it's not coming. Good. We're gonna have to get better at bare bones, and it's gonna up our skill. You know, just
The
it's kind of a
reframe.
stoic way
I
to
like
do it,
that.
right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it's maybe 2 minutes. And they've set it to music. And so that's not a conversation. It came out
Mm-hmm.
of a conversation, right? It's a 2 minute snippet that's been re-edited. If
Mm-hmm.
you listen to the whole, 2 hour podcast, it's amazing how that conversation arose. But when you're getting the snippet, you're not getting the conversation. You're just getting, it's like eating the orange versus just getting
Yep.
some freshly squeezed orange juice. It's not the
Mm-hmm.
conversation, it's the juice from it.
Okay, so let's talk about that because the long form conversation gives context, so you can hear the nuance, and the short clips gives the candy, right? Hey, here's a sample that we curated, packaged, presented in a nice way. Hopefully, that would be the nugget that you've been looking for. So, so is that that approach, right? To scale conversations or good conversations that awakens people, to have long form conversation with interesting people, and then curate, package nuggets that we think is useful, and then serve it up like a sampler, like a orange chicken at Panda Express.
I mean, it's really the snippets are advertising, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, here it's like the if you go to Costco and here's a little taste of this uh, kung pao chicken. Look at that. You can
Mm-hmm.
microwave it, or here's this cheese, or whatever they give you, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Uh, maybe there are people who just go, okay, they go on a date. Okay, come on, honey, we're going to go to Costco, and they just go from station to station,
Uh-huh.
and then they go buy a bottle of wine, and they're good to go. I don't know.
Right, but bring back to the spirit of scaling transformation. I'm just curious, do you see it possible to scale transformational experiences through these type of content media experiences? And by the way, I asked that question because I fantasize, there's a transformational media to be able to awaken, to empower people to live a life of deep joy and purpose at scale, because there's no enough time and effort and energy of the day where I can speak to everyone, one on one. Just not possible. So this is my fantasy of expanding and amplifying that.
I don't know is the answer. I think there are certain times when you can be listening in on a conversation and it hits you that it really transforms something.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I go to sleep listening to a podcast,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a very conversational podcast, and I realize I'm dreaming, and I am talking to the other. I'm part of the podcast. Someone's saying something and I'm replying to the host in my dream, and I remember being very annoyed that it seems like the host isn't listening to me.
That's funny.
Then I wake up and I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe because I wasn't there at the recording,
Uh,
right? So I bring that up because there's something about transformation that's very personal,
mm-hmm.
and probably most everyone in our audience at this point knows what we mean by transformation, but I think
Or you
it's
can
worth.
define it if you want.
Yeah, so the way I look at transformation is that you have an experience that touches you so much that in an important way, you're a different human being on the other side of it. So when you ask me, is transformation possible in this medium? Usually transformation is someone is holding a space for you, dealing with a particular question you have, and you get on the other side of this question. So you've had a trauma as a kid, and you thought that this, try and use an example that's not super, um, so, I don't know, let's say a little boy's parents got divorced when he was 3 years old. And his father turns, like his father leaves the house. They have two separate households. And the little boy thinks that the father is leaving him, doesn't want to be in his life because he's moving out. And that's, if he was an adult, he could he would have a different context around it, right? And so you have a transformational experience where maybe someone else is talking about what it was like when they had to leave the shared home, and they were looking at their kids in the eye, and they were, whatever, and they're going through their experience. And then the person who was a kid was on the other side of it. That discussion recontextualizes it for them, and it
Hmm.
transforms them where they, instead of in their own place, where like I'm the hurt child my whole life,
Hmm.
you can get to see it in another side and go, oh, really? That, my dad actually did love me and didn't want to leave me. And I just, I was 3 years old, so I interpreted it that way. But now that I'm 25, I can see that's not what happened. I've seen that happen on a very personal level when someone's holding space for him. I suppose that it's possible that you listen to a conversation and it hits something personal for you, and then you are transformed from that conversation.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know. That's what I see.
Yeah. And obviously, I wasn't looking for the answer. I was looking for a response, right? It's something that I
Sure.
think about a lot, um, because of how passionate I'm about in this type of work. How do we intentionally create content that help them shift the way they look at the world, going from burnout to deep joy and purpose, as the purpose of the podcast is today.
Well, spitballing, I think if you're trying to do it on purpose, the place to start would be the different spaces a person goes through from birth to death, and
Hmm.
have conversations around that spectrum. And
Hmm.
then people who are going through those kind of issues, whether that's because that's their age or because,
Hmm.
that's someone they love, they're going through that age. Maybe that's a place to start.
Yeah, thank you. You actually mentioned it earlier. You had said, your opinion or response is different if it's a 21-year-old versus 45 versus 65, right? There are different stages of development one goes through in life, also different life events that happens during those time. You have you so I found spiral dynamics to be quite instructive when you think about stages of development in terms of one's consciousness. Is there a framework or that you either invented yourself or come across that articulate the development stages really well, really well?
Hmm. I've seen a few. I'm just trying to remember. Uh, I haven't got a good one off the top of my head for you. I've seen some that are pretty interesting. Um, ooh, like I've seen some that take a framework like Myers-Briggs and they
Mm-hmm.
map it over time. So if you got a particular way you see people,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then go, like, so a person who's ENTJ will start off this way, and they go through these different experiences, and this is what typically will happen for them. But I don't
Mm-hmm.
know, I don't think that's exactly where you're headed with it. So
No,
to
just
think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean Confucius actually had something similar. He says 生老病死. It means being born, getting old, getting sick, and dying. These are stages of development. He said it. I learned it. I just never saw it that way. Like, oh yeah, what a wise guy.
It sounds so much better in Chinese.
Yeah, Chinese is very succinct. They can communicate something that would take the English language a paragraph or two or three paragraphs instead of like a single sentence. So yeah. Um. Well, I mean, what do you want to talk about next? I have things that I could ask you, but what are some of the things that you see this conversation is going?
Uh, well, it's a little bit, may not be where you think I would ask you, but I'm curious how being a native Chinese speaker gives you a different view on the West than maybe some of your friends that don't speak Chinese.
That don't speak Chinese.
Yeah, or just don't
Yeah,
have that.
well, we're born and raised here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Anytime somebody asks me that question, it's really hard to discern because fish doesn't see water. So since I swim in the water, my
Let me
worldview.
let me distinguish some water for you that will help you answer the
Okay.
question.
Great. Thank you.
So when our mutual friend Yin Ting Chu.
Uh-huh.
So it's really interesting for me when I speak to both of you. Like you're very different people,
Mm-hmm.
but I love it when I can catch either of you speaking Chinese,
Mm-hmm.
and like you're both very articulate in English, and yet when you speak Chinese, there's a like, oh, that's the real CK,
Oh,
right?
interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
So yeah. So um, like say the expression when you drink the water, remember who
Mm-hmm.
dug the well.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say that?
饮水思源.
Okay, say it quickly as if I speak Chinese.
饮水思源.
Yeah. So the thing about listening to people speak Chinese is it's a tonal language, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can say one sound with a different tone, and it means, one of them will mean wise man, the other one will say dog shit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like,
Sure.
I'm not using the right example, but you know
I
what I'm talking
understand.
about, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so there's something about your brain and his brain that distinguishes tone in terms of expression.
Mm.
And so when you speak Chinese, I hear a clarity. Like there's a whole extra dimension to your communication that
Mm.
isn't there in English. Not for any failure in your English,
I understand. Yeah.
right? And so I wonder if that extrapolates to when you listen to people, you hear something in their tones that they themselves don't hear.
Mm. Good question. It's something that I actually never really pay attention to. I am very musical, so that's the thing. So this is one thing that some of my musician friends are really jealous. I have really good auditory memory. So if I hear a song once or as it's going, I can kind of predict where the song's going. I can sing along with it. They're like, "How did you know the song?" I was like, "I don't know the song. I just heard it just like you did." And like, what? I have basically instant auditory memory thanks to some of the music trainings and probably the tonal language of Chinese. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Like I'm learning Spanish
Hmm.
and my baby is learning English. And it's
Your baby.
so Isela.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, and it's so funny because she's making the inverse mistakes than I am, right? So in Spanish, if you and it depends whether you come from Mexico or Spain, different. I won't bore you with the details, but when you say I, it's yo, yo,
Hmm. Hmm.
but she'll pronounce it jo, so her Y's are a J,
That's
right?
right.
So the way she wants to say yesterday is yesterday.
Mm.
I went here yesterday, right? And her Y's are J's, but her J's are Y's, right?
Hmm.
So when it's just hilarious, and I make the same mistake in Spanish the other way. And so we're constantly correcting each other, and it's pretty funny. But it shapes the way. So when you so I do Duolingo, and one of the things you do is you just listen to a particular phrase, and you've got to repeat it, and then you've got to translate it.
Mm-hmm.
And I sound like such a gringo, and she sounds Spanish when she says it in English. And you realize how much of it, like when I first started, it seemed like the person's speaking a million miles an hour.
That's right.
And then as you learn more and more, you can hear that, oh, that's simple. That's what they're saying. But you are trained in hearing things I'm not trained in hearing because you've got the tonal language.
Mm.
So if you compare Spanish to English or English to Hebrew, there's certain sounds I can make, like my daughter's name is Holly, not
Mm.
Holly,
The H
right? But
sound, yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, but the ch sound you can't make unless you've been trained to make it. Um, and it's similar for things, but in Chinese, there's sounds I can't even access, but you could say them naturally,
Mm-hmm.
and you can hear things tonally. I wonder about how that shapes brains.
I mean, this is what we're discussing here is, to me, a finer understanding of certain things, the understanding of distinctions, the ability to distinguish a very subtle nuance. I think the example they gave is how many ways can you describe snow? There's only one word for snow in English. According to lore, the Eskimos has like 16 different ways to say snow. Like, wow, that's really different. Or certain people can have 17 different ways to say green, so that can actually see the nuances of it.
Well, you
I
don't even
have,
have to go to Eskimo. You just go to people who ski. They
mm-hmm,
can tell you the difference between powder, champagne powder, ice pack,
mm-hmm,
granular. They've got, I don't remember all the words, but like when you ski and you say you've got, champagne powder, you think you're in Colorado and you know exactly what that feels like. And
mm-hmm.
if you ski in Utah versus skiing in Colorado, it just feels different snow, and they've got different names for it. Anyway, I interrupted you. Where were you going with this?
No, I was gonna say, because I've been accused of being very much in my head because I love distinctions, as you know.
Hmm.
And then much of the work that we do in terms of transformation is a way of, it's about a way of being rather than just content distinctions. Can you say a little bit more about that for people who um is trying to understand, who is addicted to understanding versus focusing on the mind, focusing on the way of being?
So when you talk about distinctions,
Mm-hmm.
it's a concept that once you understand it, you just get it, and there's no going back. So the classic example is when you learn how to ride a bike, you learn balance. There's a moment where you're flailing around on the bike and you don't know how to ride a bike, and then all of a sudden you do, and you start practicing, and you can do all sorts of weird things with a bike. You can do wheelies, and you can go move side to side, and when you've got the balance, it may look like it's out of control, but it isn't. And so balance, you could say riding a bike is a distinction, or balancing is a distinction. And it's a very useful concept because when you're talking about bike riding and you look at someone, like if you ever watch a little kid learning to ride a bike, they don't have the distinction balance. You just look at how the bike is moving and how they're moving in concert with the bike. They just don't get it. So that's distinction. And then when you talk about like how that helps you in terms of moving forward in life, we've got all these different thoughts, and there's a lot going on in our head. So if we can take a distinction, it's a way to get a handle on your thoughts in a way that allows you to distinguish between different things that are going on and discard the stuff that is not useful in the moment and focus on the part that is useful. So, for example, I talked earlier about rumination. Oh my God, does that girl like me? Does she not like me? When you get the distinction rumination, you're listening to those thoughts. Oh, this is just rumination. I don't need to do a fine examination of all the words I said. I can just sort of take that entire piece of what's going on in my head, put it to the side and say, okay, I'm not going to ruminate. Now there's, you can make a distinction called action. Okay, what actions can I take? So you're going through in your head and you're going through, well, you can call her up and ask her out on a date. I can see her in the hall and ask her if she likes me. I can get her flowers. But what if she doesn't like me? Ah, that was rumination. I'm out of action plan. Let me go back to actions, right? And it's a way to order your thoughts. So I think that's what you're talking about. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for clarifying that. And I was saying, because to me, having distinctions or discernment or different ideas helps to, as you said, discern what's the appropriate action to take in that moment. So there's value in distinctions. There's also value in just don't think, just do. And to me, the distinctions are proxy or tools to help get to the ideal state that I wanted to be, right? So I think there's a balance in that, because I don't know about you, personal experience. I need the distinction to get to a place of no thought. I needed to do that. That's part of my path of mastery. So when somebody who may be able to elicit a state, a way of being in the moment, and then they tell me, don't think, just do, and that gives me no access to actually do it. A case in point, when I was first starting doing this work, I hated when somebody would tell me, just be authentic. I'm like, what do you mean? How do you do that? And no steps, no action plans to do that. So, anyways, that's the
That's
point I was. Mhm.
part of the issue is that they weren't buying that you were being authentic when you were.
Mhm.
So maybe you were being authentic and they didn't like it.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
anyway, so when you say, is it useful for you when people say, don't think, just do?
Not at all.
Okay. It wouldn't be useful for me at all. So you asked me, like, what do I like about the men's work?
Mhm.
So one of the things that I learned about it is how to be better with women that I'm interested in, right? And so one of the distinctions that I learned was be bold, right? Be bold is not be a jackass, but be bold. So for a man, for me, it's get out of your comfort zone. Um, before before I learned that, I was like, well, why can't she be bold, or why can't she tell me how she feels? Well, for whatever reason, the way it works really well is if a man is bold. Now, what happens sometimes when they're bold is they flame out hopelessly, right? When you're young, you really have no idea whether, um, like, you just have no clue whether the person that you're interested in has any interest in you because you're so in your own head, you're not listening. One of the great benefits of the courses I did around listening was, so one of the courses I did that you wouldn't imagine would make a difference, but I took this very advanced course in negotiation skills and taught you like what are the distinctions around negotiation, and there's a whole bunch of them about paying attention to what is important to the other side and what you could do to figure out what they really care about versus what they said they care about, right? You can understand how that be important in emotions in negotiations. So 3 days after that negotiation skills class, it was in England. I came home and my jet lag, and I went on a blind date. This is not somebody I wound up dating for very long, but we're sitting down in Coffee Bean, and I'm just like, I wasn't even thinking anything. I'd spent a week practicing negotiation skills, and I'm just talking to her, and I'm like, oh my God, she's interested in me. Oh my God, she's totally nervous. She doesn't know what, like, I all of a sudden, like, it was like this, like I could pay attention to a girl that I'm dating and have some clue whether she's interested in me or not, and some clue about what's going on with her, if I just get out of my own head.
Mm.
And you would think like I took some dating class, or no, it was just a negotiation skills class.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do a corporate deal to buy real estate that makes, that allows you to get 10% better margin on it and be more successful in your job? But it requires paying attention. So when you talk about being authentic, or you talk about, okay, don't just think, do something. What's more useful is if you give somebody on the, don't do this, great, then give them a distinction on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be all in your head, be bold. And you understand what be bold is. Take a risk. Put out there that you're interested in the other person before they tell you they are. Okay. And you understand you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. Sometimes just because you're not so good at this yet, you have no clue where the other person is, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So now you're doing something, you're learning, right? If someone taught you what bold was and said, don't stop thinking, be bold. Could you do something with that?
It's more actionable for sure. But I would actually say do this. Like, here's an example of being bold look like.
Okay.
Right, right, down to the atomic actions that one could take.
So in my world, when they're teaching you the distinction, be bold, they're doing all that. So then they turn
Got it.
around and go, be bold. But yeah,
Gotcha.
I'm with you.
Yeah. So you actually mentioned, we had a long discussion about risk, liveness. Maybe we double click on that, because you had just mentioned, the ability to take a risk and how important it is to make us feel alive. And maybe we can double click on that further.
Sure.
Yeah.
So imagine you're let's say you're a girl that's maybe you're in your late 20s, and you've had, four serious boyfriends, and you go on a lot of dates, and you're unhappy about where things are going. Maybe by this age, you've played out all the scenarios you're going to, that you've encountered. You know that a guy that's got this profile, maybe you've dated three or four lawyers, and like you kind of know what the lawyer thing looks like, and you've you've been set up by, variety of your friends. And so there's probably, you know, you've gone on 40 first dates, and maybe five of those turned into something, and maybe 10 of them turned into you're dating somebody for a few weeks and what have you. And so you've got all these really well established patterns, and kind of, predictably what your life is going to be like, and you're going to settle on one of these people to go forward. So what would it look like to shake up your life and be something different? So one thing you could do is examine your assumptions. So a lot of women have lists for what they're looking for, right? And they have certain assumptions about who people are and how they are. And by the way, we all do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for her, taking a risk might be say yes to somebody you never would have said yes to. It doesn't mean you need to, go out with them for a long time or sleep with them or anything like that. But maybe go on a first date with somebody you never would have otherwise. Take a risk, do something different, and learn something about in life. Maybe what it looks like is, go do some activity you would never do before. So take a risk, sign up for a marathon, or, like there's some there's something about being at risk that has human beings be alive. Now, maybe evolutionarily, because what we've learned is that if you don't take risks, you will you're less likely to survive if you don't take risks at all than if you take some risks. And um, risk taking is kind of programmed into our brains and our ways of being. But um, I found that taking risks is the way to keep alive. Like, I know you're someone that's become a more of a risk taker. What is it that had you start taking risks?
I would say risk for me in the very beginning was, well, risk. So you want to be as risk averse as possible. But then I had the distinction realizing that, risk is actually could have a positive, profitable payoff. So I started looking at it more in the monetary sense. But I really like the way you articulated risk and aliveness, because at the other side of risk, you do feel more alive. And I noticed, looking at my life through that frame, I've taken a bunch of risk ever since I was, 5, 16. So there's some major risk that I took. Some recklessly, right? In hindsight, not so smart, but some you really helped me come alive. I really love it. So how's it working out? It's working out great. I wouldn't be here if I had not done the taking the risk of, convincing my parents to let me come to the United States by myself.
I think part of the problem in discussing risk is that there's a set of meanings around risk that are very financial and that are
Mhm.
very like percentages oriented. So Nassim Taleb talks about, when he talks about risk in the Black Swan, he talks about how you want to avoid the risk of ruin, right? Your
Mhm.
grandmother taught you not to take certain risks because even if there's a, very small percentage chance, if there's a 1% chance of dying, don't do an activity. Like if you say, there better be, if you're going to take a 1% risk of dying on an activity that you're going to do 100 times, chances are you're going to die from that activity, right?
Mhm.
It's not really risk. You do the computation that way.
Expected
So
value, yeah. Mhm.
yeah, we'll say more about that.
Oh, expected value? Like what's the
Yeah,
payoff times the probability of that payoff happening
yeah.
minus, you know.
So if you're good at crunching numbers, you know that just because something has a low probability one way you state it, it's not actually that low probability when you do the full equation, right? Good MBA students or physics students or statistics students know that. But if you're not numbers oriented, the way to think about risk is um, if there's a small probability of me having a bad outcome, and I'm going to repeat that activity over and over again, I'm going to get the bad result. It's like playing Russian roulette. You got one bullet, six chambers. Yeah, 5 out of 6 times you're okay, but that's too big a risk to take.
Mhm.
But let's get over to the side of the risk of the good kind of risks. Um, Particularly the good kind of risks to take are the things that feel risky, but really aren't a risk. So for uh, a young person doing something out of their comfort zone feels like it's a big risk. So let's say you're a 16-year-old girl and you are pretty shy. It'd be a huge risk for you to go on the debate team and or have to give a speech in front of a lot of people. So for you, the risk feels like the risk of dying. It's really scary to speak in front of other people, when in fact the risk, you have zero risk of dying and actually zero risk of anything bad happening to you. When you think about it, how many times have you seen you know a young person give a speech and they gave a bad speech? Did you even think worse of the person? Was it a big deal? I mean, for the person it's a huge embarrassment, but for the audience, like, there really is, in reality, right, the harsh reality is nobody cares if your speech is good or not. And on the other side of taking that risk, you're going to be a different person. So when we talk about taking a risk, those are the risks that are the ones you should take every time, right? Should I talk to this person? Well, if you look at them and they seem, there's nothing scary about that person. There's, you assess it and you're not going to be in any physical harm. Then talking to a new person is a chance to make a new friend. It's a chance to learn new perspective. That kind of risk just feels like a risk. It isn't really a risk. You know what I mean?
I do. I do. I mean, starting this podcast in my mind was a huge thing. The way I talked about it, right? And it
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
until Intin Chu encouraged me, and I'm very, very thankful for him nudging me over to start this podcast, being such a enriching experience so far.
yeah.
So, um, so on that note, learning things in public, teaching in public, because for some people to be an interviewer, there's very little risk, actual risk, but to actually share your thoughts online for all in the world to see, it's the perceived risk is really, really high. So as someone who used to share your thoughts to the world, how would you, knowing what you know today, what are the actual risk versus the perceived risk of sharing your thoughts online?
Um, I mean, the only way that there's the environment I grew up in, there was very little risk anyway, because the environment I grew up on, people didn't really so much care what other people thought. It seems like, if you work at a company where expressing the wrong opinions can get you in trouble, then sharing your opinions online um, can be dangerous if you have opinions that are not in line with the place you work at.
Hmm.
So, for those people, that's a real risk. If
Losing
you
their
don't,
livelihood. Yep. Hmm.
yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of examples. I'm just thinking of recent ones. Um, just like if you're Elon Musk and you have opinions that people don't like, well, you have your own companies, you have, a lot of money. So who cares what other people think? On the other hand, if you work for Facebook and you believe something that's contrary to what your coworkers believe, then you could get fired and you get ostracized. So those are real risks today that didn't used to have. When I grew up, they weren't real risks. So you put that category aside, and I know for some people that's a big category. But if you put that category aside, what is the risk? That people are not going to like your opinions. Okay, people are going to make fun of you. People are going to get angry with you. I mean, that supposes first that they watch. you know, like anything I say, first people have to watch it or listen to it, and then be offended by it, and then be called to action to do something against me. So I don't know. For me anyway, I don't see that as a huge issue.
What about the payoff, the aliveness, the possible payoff from learning things publicly, sharing thoughts publicly? Because again, you don't do it today, but you did it before. Whereas some of the possible payoff that um, of learning things in public.
Well, the payoff is that you would meet people you otherwise wouldn't meet, and you'd interact with people and learn from people that you never would otherwise. So, like I'll sometimes read some people that write for very big publications, and I know them, and like I know them personally. I've been to dinner at their house, or I can email them or DM them on Twitter and go, hey, what's really going on over here? Like what everyone's saying X, Y, and Z, but like what's really going on? Because this makes no sense to me.
So having more
And
access to people, having more access to privileged information is a payoff.
that's a payoff.
Mhm.
Um, and when smart people interact with you, you learn more. So,
Mm.
somebody contacts you, said, that's I saw your whole thing on this, and I've got this whole different framework. One of the things that um, as you get older, like I'll say it from my grandmaster martial arts teacher. His lament is that his teachers have all died, and he's proficient in so many martial arts styles. There's so little new for him to find, so he
Mm.
just cherishes every time he can find something new to learn.
Hmm.
And so when you do big public conversations, there may be somebody, and I would have no other way of even knowing they exist. I'll find out about things that are, just amazing.
Mm.
So one example for me, one of my passions is linguistics. And
Mm. I didn't know
until
that. That's cool.
yeah, sometimes you'll hear me. I mean, you could even hear me, like, why did I ask you about the Chinese tonal language and the whole thing I said about
Mm.
Spanish? It didn't used to be one of my passions, but John McWhorter started making a podcast about it called Lexicon Valley. And I
Mm.
started listening to it, and I found it gave me a whole new framework about how to look at life.
Mm.
And I kind of threw the transformational piece on it, and I just got, oh, well, okay. So I started observing. That's when I would observe you and Chu, and kind of how the way you would talk. And um, like I speak Hebrew, I speak Yiddish. So when I speak Yiddish, I would have means I also understand German. And so listening to the way German people express a thought versus listening to how French people express the thought, um, all that stuff is fascinating. And so when I started listening to McWhorter's Lexicon Valley, I wound up buying some of his books on Audible and learned all about language families and some really critical frameworks about how I understand the world wouldn't be there now. Like I really understand that if you grew up in the Roman Empire and you spoke Latin and somehow you were frozen in the ice and you woke up now and you say, where's Latin? People would say, well, they study it in church, or this language. But really, what is Latin? Latin is now French, it's now Italian, it's now all these different Romance languages. To a certain extent, it's English. It's that's what happens to language. And back then it was this thing they called Latin.
Mm.
And 400 years later, there's this thing they called Latin. It's not the same thing. The thing that Chaucer called English and the thing we call English is different. So I laugh about how British people get all ornery and say we speak the real English. Well, you if you had somebody in Chaucer's day talk to you, they would say you'd be as incomprehensible to them as an American would be, and it's just
Yeah.
not the way languages work.
Yeah. Language, ideas, memes. These are all living and breathing things, just like a comet flying through space. Things are getting left behind, certain things are getting formed, new icicles are being formed. And let me bring it back to the whole idea of learning and publishing things online. To me, online is a serendipity, synchronicity machine. And if I want to have more serendipities, more synchronicities, whether it's meeting people or learning new things or having new opportunities, or, to me, these are the reward of synchronicity outweighs whatever perceived risk may be. Hence why I'm continuing to do this. What's your take on that? Thinking about the internet online as a way to expand one's resourcefulness.
Yeah, I think the internet is just a different way for us to connect with each other, and it's got all the good and the bad of human beings. Like all the things we hate about the internet are things we hate about ourselves and hate about each other. No, I mean, you look at Twitter. I know how to have a big social media presence. I don't mean
Mhm,
intellectually. I mean, there's a way that I can be that's going to have people follow me.
mhm,
And I started doing that when I first started Twitter, and I realized I didn't like who I was. Like, it cultivates the real asshole in me, the real biting. I can be really biting and mean.
mhm,
Um, and it's in general life, it's something I keep in check.
mhm,
Like every now and again, I'll say something really hurtful to people. And and when I was younger, I said it because it was super clever. Like, you got to
mhm,
hear this. Like, I got a particularly great way of, saying this thing. But
mhm,
because it's in person and I could see, oh man, I didn't really mean to like crush you by saying that. It was just hilarious. I thought I've learned to shut my mouth, and like I will say something biting, but I'm much more careful about how I do that. But I don't have the feet like Twitter encourages that. It really pulls that out of you.
Yeah.
And when I access that side of me, I get a lot of retweets, get a lot of people following me, and I become somebody I really don't like. So my presence in Twitter is mostly reading other people, occasionally interacting with people, but it's more like I'll ask a question or, something like that. I really, um, I don't like who I become. And,
Mm.
could say the same thing about a lot of the social media. So, uh, yeah, I don't know how to solve that problem. That we have the great things about scaling and we have the horrible things about scaling.
Yeah.
I don't know. I
Because
hope we
you and
get
I,
better at it.
because you and I, we talked about, um, well, actually, I'll quote this person. I can't remember where I got it from. I think it's Rami Sethi, or anyways, one of the internet thought leaders out there. He said the mistake that people make when they go online is they try to bring their whole self into who they are online, versus if you want to do it right, just bring a aspect of yours. I don't remember who it was. It was Diego Forte. He said the way to be successful online for influence, following, and so forth is just really honing in a particular aspect of you. It's not inauthentic. It's still you, but it's one cut, one aspect only. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one aspect depending on the channel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a Facebook you, I think there's a LinkedIn you, I think there's a Twitter you,
Mm-hmm.
but the algorithms are pulling out that aspect of you. So I mean, I agree with what that person is saying, but um, there's what you're pulling for. A video medium will pull for something different than like one of the things famously Twitter started with a very small number of characters.
Yeah,
So
140.
yeah. And so I think something was lost when it went to 280, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you didn't have to be that clever and that tight with your tweets.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember there used to be this website, maybe it's still out there, called 100 Words?
No.
And their challenge was you just write something, anything, in 100 words a day. And I did that kind of as a discipline for a couple of months. I found that it called for a certain kind of writing. It called for a certain kind of idea. Um, I don't think this is answering your question, but it's kind of where my mind is going.
Okay.
What I'll say about social media is that the context is the constraints will form the context to a large degree,
Yep.
and you've got to impose very strong context to overcome what the constraints of a medium will do.
Yep. Well, what do you think this long form medium that we're doing right now pulls for?
Mm. Well, okay. I wasn't going to mention it, but so here's the interesting thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's how I would naturally talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at you, I'm getting the full experience of your face, and I'm understanding you 100%.
Mm-hmm.
For most of this podcast, this is how I've been talking to you. Because if I'm not looking at the camera,
Mm-hmm.
the audience has the experience, I'm not paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually requires I'm looking at you out of the side of my eye, trying to get as much of your expression as I can, and I'm trying to be as natural as possible,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it looks better,
Mm-hmm.
but this feels good, and it looks like I'm not paying attention at all, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like when you think about it, and I don't know how much I've spent trying to figure out some way of taking this camera and having it be here when I talk to you.
Yeah.
And I haven't had that successful. So I've done all these different camera setups with tripods, with anything. And I
Yeah.
just for Zoom meetings so that
Yeah.
I can have more like for me, when I'm looking at you in the eye, I'm
Yeah.
getting CK. There's CK.
Yeah.
But it looks to you now like I'm looking you in the eye and I'm just looking at this Logitech monitor
Yeah.
or focused on the little thing behind me. And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, so going behind the fourth wall. So what, like what is missing from my conversation on one hand when I'm looking at you and this is natural versus I'm looking at the camera, but the audience has the experience that I'm paying attention to them. And so whatever artifacts you have out of me talking like this versus talking like this, with a plus minus of each way of doing it, that's what this medium is pulling for.
I see. Got it. Well, that's partially the question. That's partially the response. By the way, I have an easy solution for you: teleprompters and an iPad. So,
Yeah, I've tried that.
well, anyways, as in because you can actually draw the person in front of. Anyways,
No, no,
it's
no, I know.
yeah,
So there's
it's how
a
I do it. Yeah. So if that's a solution you're looking for, that's I
yeah.
figure out how to
So
do it.
there's a particular camera with a particular thing, and I've tried it, and it gives you. Um, yeah, I get you. So you're looking straight at the camera, and you're looking at me now, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. So Glenn Reynolds wrote an article on this. He's a law professor, and
Okay.
he had the exact setup, and he's like, this is the teleprompter you use, this is the iPad you use, this is the
Yep.
camera you
The
use. Yeah,
software. Yeah. All that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But so it was that, but not so much what I was looking for. It's because you had talked about the constraints forces the response, right? Everything is contextual. So the context, the environment, the constraints that we talked about, 140 characters, 100 words gives pulls out a different aspect of the person. In this case, you. So I was curious to know in this long form medium that we now have, we're having a conversation. What do you think it pulls for versus, a 60-minute or 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 1 minute engagement with each other?
The long form pulls for exploring an idea to its completion.
Mm,
So this conversation is over when it's more naturally over.
mm,
As like when you and I have a phone call, um, it usually ends when one of us have an appointment.
yes.
It'll just go on and on and on, right?
Hmm.
I don't know what the average length of your podcast is, but you and I tend to have longer conversations. And so we don't have the constraint of time. I mean, maybe you need to edit it in post, or maybe, the
Hmm.
audience can't sit through this much of it, but the actual what it pulls for is completion, I think.
Hmm. Hmm. Completion also, yeah, exploration of some random ideas, versus, and that's the thing that I grapple with because there are two parts that I know that my audience like because that's who I am. The exploration of blue sky ideas, very philosophical, very esoteric, very nuanced. And there's also an aspect of me that's all about taking action. What's the atomic, habit or a action you're gonna take or a discipline you're gonna have. So then you can go out and gather actual data versus just having an intellectual understanding of something. So it's the yin and the yang.
What
So
is it that what about the medium pulls for that? I'm missing that.
no,
Or
no,
is
I'm
that
saying
just
that's
you?
what I'm about. But so the medium, the long form allows me to have a lot of spaciousness to go explore and then get tactical, go explore and get tactical. That's the grappling because I believe there are two types of people. One is they really like exploring. Two, they really like taking actions. So swimming in this and keeping a good balance is something that I think about, but I'm really pay attention to. Anyways, just a thought.
Yeah, but that's not a constraint. That's just you, right?
That's just me. Correct. Yeah.
Not like it's just you. It's good that it's you, but
Yeah. I got you. I got you. Yeah.
yeah, I pull for very long conversations.
You
I'm more
enjoy a
about
very
the
long
journey.
conversation? Yeah.
I'm more about the journey than I mean, you'll always hear me at the end of a conversation go, so what did you get from that? So I want people to pull out. If I'm coaching somebody or what have you, I want people to pull out. So crystallize now at the end of the conversation, what did you get from that? But I
Yeah.
won't force the conversation in a particular direction.
Mm. Okay, so say more about that. You don't want to,
Um,
because.
Conversation is a
Hmm.
living thing. So there's CK, there's Martin, and then there's the conversation.
Hmm.
And it's to borrow a term from something we know, it's a third entity.
Hmm.
It's the conversation, right?
Hmm.
So you and I could be having a conversation about taking risks,
Hmm.
and then Chu comes in, and we have a third box, and he has different things. So the conversation, it's still a conversation, but it alters a little bit. And then I don't know, Judy Gantley and Jen Herda watch this thing,
Hmm.
and they have this own conversation about risk, just coming out of the conversation we have, and maybe they record it, and you listen to them talk about it informed from this conversation. So the conversation will morph. Like I look at it energetically, and I can say it starts out red and orange, and then Chu comes in and he adds a little bit of yellow, and then Judy comes in, adds some blue, and Jen adds some green, and now it's a rainbow conversation. um, and more and more people are having this conversation, and all of a sudden, you'll see it on the Today Show. People
Hmm.
are talking about risk, and those crazy internet kids, I don't know where it started, but for some reason people are talking about that. And all of a sudden you'll hear, whoever's host of the Today Show these days talk to a motorcycle BMX rider who does lots of tricks, and they'll talk about risk that way, and they'll go a whole different way we want to talk about. So the way I look about conversations is, um, I will. It's more like fluid, more like water, more like a river. So I'll add my piece, but I'll respect the conversation.
Well, but then you're also an expert facilitator as well. So I guess the heart of that question, for at least for me, is how much allowing, how much guidance, how much leadership you take. Because as a former dancer myself, I did salsa dancing, as you know. You know, what we're talking about is how strong of a lead you want to be as a facilitator. I think as a participant, sure, you can just kind of go wherever the conversation goes, but as a facilitator, there needs to be guidance and leadership.
Um, I don't think dancing. I mean, there's dancing in the conversation, right?
Hmm.
But with dancing, I'm not an expert dancer, so maybe my analogy will be bad. I think with dancing, in the beginning, there's a leader and a follower. But at least my observation of like advanced dancers is it's almost like the follower is anticipating where the leader will go, and it's more of a give and take and less of a lead follow.
Hmm.
So even if your conversation takes that structure, just like in dance, there's the dance,
Hmm.
and in conversation, there's the conversation. So, and I think the conversation between two people maybe be more like a dance.
Hmm.
But if you've got five people in the conversation, and if so you're talking about facilitating a conversation. The way I look at it is I'm the container, and the extent to which I lead is the extent to which I take the shape of the container, so that the the conversation may not fill up the entire container, but um,
That was very
uh,
abstract. Say that again one more time.
let me see if I can say it in a less abstract way. When I lead a conversation, I am I'm more like the shape of the container. So allow the water to flow into that container.
Hmm.
But the container is much bigger than the amount of water there is. So this part of the container might feel like a flask, and it can roll in, and there's a circular glob to it, and there's a triangular piece here, and there's this whole other piece here. and maybe we only inhabit the first couple of shapes. There's more shapes to go. So the extent to which I'm holding the space, I'm like, okay, we're not going to go into this place where the people in the conversation disrespect each other. So that container doesn't contain that part of it. So that's where I'm issuing the constraints. So unless it's trying to devolve into something where people are bickering with each other,
Mm-hmm.
you generally won't, like, I'll be quiet. Then all of a sudden that's happening. So the part of my container will start
I
shaping the
see.
conversation, right?
Got it. Okay. So if I'm hearing you, this is my words, my understanding. So the container is large. You only interfere when it's, bickering or friction or certain boundaries are crossed. Then you step in to strongly guide the conversation towards what it needs. But otherwise, you're minimalistic. You're very, yeah, minimalistic is probably the best word to describe it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Does that scale? What do you think? Because I've seen you facilitate a conversation between small group of people, 50 people, 100, 300 people. What do you think about the scalability of conversations and then, the ability to contain that conversation?
Um, I don't know. What do you think? You see me with a large group of people. Does
I
it
mean,
scale?
I don't know. It's I don't have an
Are they
answer.
good conversations?
They were good conversations for sure.
Yeah.
But
So
I guess the question was more around, I know it works because I've seen it done up to that level, and then what's beyond, right? Because we also had conversations about Discord, how, conversation just happens a lot more in those containers, and we were wondering the purpose of that and also creating containers for that. It's
so
an
you're
art.
asking questions that I can speculate about, but I don't have answers to.
Hmm.
So let's say I'm leading a conversation in person with 60 people, 50 to 75 people. And are you asking, does that scale? So the thing I don't talk about, but is very much part of the process is I'm sensitive to energy. So I get a read on what's going on in the room beyond the individuals. Like I can kind of feel where the group is going energetically. I can do that in like technology like this. So let's say we had 75 people on a Zoom. Um, this is very weird. If they're all on mute, it's much harder to do than if they're not on mute. Maybe it's something about I pick up on the breathing. Like in the room, I just really feel the energy and I can get what's going on. In a Zoom kind of thing, there's certain I don't know what it is exactly I do, but there's certain markers that I get what's going on. Um, so if you use electronic means, it gets like it's harder and harder to get the cues to get what's going on to be able to hold the space.
Hmm.
My intuition will help me do that, but it's a lot easier to do that in person. So that
Hmm.
part of it scales more. Is that like answering your question?
It does. Because one keen interest that I have is the scalability of transformation. And then, you and I, we've been in, let's say, Tony Robbins, seminar where he has, I don't know, 10,000 people or something like that. Was it a transformational event? I think it's for some, not for me personally. It was a really cool transformational rock concert, right? It's a beautiful experience. Um, but I also understand because it was 10,000 people, how do you create a transformational container? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, when he did it to 150 people, I know people who did it back then. It was very much so a transformational experience.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I think he does the firewalk in part to do that to scale, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And he's got the huge screens to do it to scale, and he's in the room and he's got people walking the room. Um, but I don't know. Like it doesn't definitely didn't feel like a transformational experience for me. Um, and I've led some of the exercises that he led, and it just at that scale, it's much better at of transmitting information. Like I
Mm-hmm.
learned a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and I met the love of my life there, so I got a
Mm-hmm.
lot out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't, I didn't like, I didn't come out of there a different man
Mm-hmm.
after that. I think that's what I would say transformationally. Um, I got 10 to 15 concepts that I still quote and talk to other people about, which were really excellent. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the same for you. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, it was a great experience. It was cool to see, like, okay, there are that many people interested in transformation. And I could see, oh, okay, so these are the mechanics of how do you enhance the user experience. So I get more of the mechanical of operation aspect of things rather than the personal benefit of transformation, if I'm frank about it.
Yeah. So that's the same thing. It's like it's a cool experience,
Hmm.
but
Yeah.
transformation is more personal.
Yeah.
So that's why I wonder about being able to transform through a video, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. It is something I do think about. I mean, the program point is now doing a Zoom experiment, and according to the architect of that program, is going very, very well. I haven't done it myself, so I don't know, but
Which program?
point,
I mean, they got point on Zoom. Yeah.
right? That's what I mean.
Well, and Landmark's doing the Landmark Forum on Zoom. I was very skeptical of it, but someone I used to work with did the Landmark Forum, and they were raving about it online. So
Yeah.
I think sometimes,
MITT is remote as well these days, so that's these are questions that I don't have an answer to, but I'm very keen on, like, oh, this is really cool. Now you can scale transformation. That's a really
but
cool
the
concept.
question is, are they getting what we got? I mean, they don't know any better, right?
Right, you have a data point of 1, sure.
Right. So from their perspective, that's what it is.
Mhm.
But I'm skeptical.
One last question would be, what's, like, one thing that, you really wanna tell whoever's listening to our conversation? What's one thing that if you like, if this is the thing you remember, this is it?
Yeah. So if you're listening to this, I want you to think about the people that you love. Like make a list either on your fingers or just if you've got a pen and paper, write down the people that you love. Can give you a second to do that. And now think about somebody who's not on the list but really should be on the list. Now, you don't know how many more experiences you're going to have with those people. You know, you may think you've got all the time in the world, but there isn't anything I wouldn't give to have a conversation with my dad or be able to kiss my mom. And if you get one thing from me, it's like give those people a call, go visit them in person, look them in the eye, ask them the important questions, tell them that you love them, have no regrets, make sure that you leave nothing unsaid. Do that for me. That's it.
Mm, beautiful way to end it. I appreciate you, my friend. Thank you for going to different spaces that we
Thank you,
went to,
CK.
and thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and experiences with Noble Warrior.
It's really my pleasure. I'll talk to you soon, CK.